This is Marsha Jones McKee from Caribbean Books Foundation. Welcome to our very first conversation, and it's with Caribbean editors. Today, we are going to be looking at a presentation from no one other than Trinix. She'll be talking about writing nonfiction and editor's perspective. Hold on as the presentation begins. You can also hold on after the presentation, and Trinix will be online live.
Hello, writers. This is your editor, Trunix. I am a developmental editor, proofreader, part time daydreamer, secretly a dragon, and welcome to this session on writing nonfiction, an editor's perspective. So, first, let's get the obvious things out of the way. What is nonfiction? Well, the opposite of fiction. And we know what fiction is: ogres smashing, dragons raining, fire, zombie apocalypses, the weird stories that cross your idle mind at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. You get the picture. Whether it's expository, traditional, or narrative, nonfiction has its roots in fact. The fantasy and unreal are left behind, and the real world of the past, present, or even the future takes center stage. Not going to get into all the types of nonfiction here today. Maybe I'll do another session on that later. For this session, I just wanted to talk to you more about what writers can do to improve their nonfiction work based on what I've seen as an editor, and some ways that nonfiction and fiction are similar that writers tend to overlook that can actually help make their manuscript better. So, first thing on the list: find your audience, find your why. One of the things that both fiction and nonfiction have in common is that you need to know who your audience is. This may feel kind of obvious, but you would be surprised how many writers put together a whole manuscript without ever once thinking about this. The difference is in the reason you have to think about this though. For fiction writers, it helps to know who your audience is so you can make your content appropriate to reach them. Your tone, your descriptions, your character motives, everything in your story is affected by who your audience is so you can better connect with them. But for nonfiction writers, I find it better for them to focus on the why behind their writing and the needs of their audience. Because nonfiction deals with factual events, sugarcoating isn't something that you can do if that's the way it played out in real life. So, if the entire Russian Romanov monarchy was brutally assassinated secretly at night and their bodies maimed with acid to be unrecognizable even if their graves were found, that is going to remain a fact whether the audience reading are 10-year-olds or over 50. You can't really change facts to be appropriate for your audience when writing nonfiction. So if you are writing nonfiction, ask yourself, why do I want to write this book? And I don't want to hear to make money, or to tell the world my story, or to share all my great knowledge. You can want these things, but it is not enough to create an appealing book. Your job as a writer is to engage your audience, no matter what you're writing. A better way is to focus on the reader. Remember, it's not about you, even though you are the one sharing the information or telling about your story. The reader isn't there just to read long factual expositions or everything that happened every day of your childhood. Even if your life might be a buzz of activity, you need to offer the reader something that they need. For example, in Michelle Obama's book Becoming, a lot of people expected to read about all the juicy White House inside details from a former First Lady of the United States. What Michelle instead offered her audience was the chance to see how she got there, to read about the young black woman growing up trying to make her parents proud and succeed in life on her own, the young black mother who struggled with giving up her hard-earned career to stay at home and take care of her children. The young wife who supported her husband through his campaign despite dealing with the unexpected, confidence-sucking backlash of criticisms. She was telling her story, but she presented herself as a normal black woman in America, dealing with struggles millions of women like her experience every day, of feeling disappointed and inadequate and wanting more for your life. A woman just like her reader, who happened to become the wife of the first black president of the United States. If I could hazard a guess, I would say she wrote this book for the young, black, and gifted youth of the world to show them that she was just like them at one point. Young, black, and gifted, and trying to find her way in the world. And from interviews and book signings, you can see that her audience needed to see that. They connected with her that way. So, you need to find your why. The why behind the making money and sharing your knowledge with the world. Ask yourself, why am I writing this book? Why does my audience need it? Next thing we're looking at is story structure, which is another thing nonfiction has in common with fiction. You know story structure, right? Beginning, conflict, resolutions, like actual narrative arcs, because what do you know? Nonfiction can be an actual story. And writers seem to forget this when they start writing nonfiction, that it also has story structure and themes. I don't know why people assume that nonfiction doesn't need any of this because it isn't like fiction. But even something like following basic three-act structure is all you need sometimes. And conflict doesn't have to be in the form of a person either. It can take the form of a situation. And not all nonfiction books with story structure needs to take on a three-act structure either. For example, in A Society Under Siege, a study of political confusion and legal mysticism by Ramesh Saran, the narrative arc follows a non-linear structure, as it starts with the crisis, the 1990 coup on Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, and the events surrounding it. Then it goes back to explain events before or the inciting incidents and what transpires to get to that point, before returning to discussing the events after the coup. No, of course, not all nonfiction needs to follow a narrative structure. Instead of relating factual events, you might be putting together a cookbook or basic sewing manual. But all nonfiction needs structure. Writing a nonfiction book isn't like writing in a diary or chatting to a friend where conversations shift around from one topic to the next. Draft an outline. Start from the beginning and make outlines of things you want in the book. Yes, do look for patterns in your notes so you can figure out the theme. Maybe I'll do another session on plotting a nonfiction book. Just don't assume that because you are writing nonfiction that having a structure doesn't count. Next point, get creative. Now, for those of you, especially those of you who find you're writing more traditional or browsable nonfiction, find ways to get creative to draw your reader in. Don't just write words, present them creatively. For example, instead of telling about grandma's great cow heel soup recipe in your cookbook, interview Granny and insert her anecdotes into the instruction. It makes the reader feel like they've received a special part of you that only you have access to. Now, normally traditional and browsable nonfiction are very popular, but there's so much of it on the shelf these days. How to this and how to that, that it's always nice if you add a little something that makes you different. So, some simple creative ways that you can engage your reader. Use dialogue. It helps the reader experience your story better. Conduct interviews. It increases the amount of dialogue in your piece, and the reader doesn't feel like they are simply being bulldozed with fact after fact for the entire book. Also, interviews are a great part of your data collection process, so even if you don't put them directly into the story, they can help inform the narrative in some way. Use pictures. Seriously, pictures are not just for children's books. It is one of the few ways nonfiction writers can literally utilize the show not tell writing technique. I know that's not what they mean by showing not telling. It's a cheat, and I fully advocate it. Pictures and illustrations, not just graphs and charts, elaborate on information in ways that engage your reader. And many times, pictures help to tell your story and your narrative in ways that you hadn't even considered. It helps to touch the reader on a whole other level. In The Amazing Race to Entrepreneurial Freedom by Georgina Terry, even though it had no pictures, it did have a nice creative feature in it that it likened the steps to growing your business to a race. And instead of chapters, as you read, you went through miles. From mile 1, where you learned about finding your passion, until you reached the last mile, mile 26.2, where you figuratively crossed the finish line to launch your business. This is exactly what I mean by being creative in how you present your information to engage your reader. Also, in 20 Ways to Draw a Dress and 44 Other Fabulous Fashions and Accessories by Julia Guar, after a short introduction, the only other words you will encounter in the book after that are the chapter titles and the About the Author info on the last page. The book is made up entirely of clothing sketches, from dresses, hats, and shawls to shoes, halter tops, and jackets of multiple styles and from many eras, drawn exactly as they would fall on a cookie. I found this method very interesting when I first got this book because it is brilliant. I mean, think about it. For fashion students or budding designers who already understand basic lines, shapes, and patterns, they have an immediate reference that they can build off of to make their own quick sketches. And for people who can't draw to save their life, they can just trace it. No, that doesn't mean that a book with huge diagrams and detailed instructions all the way to the final sketch wouldn't be as effective for someone who actually can draw and wants to learn. But this book serves a different purpose. What if you are someone who just needs a reference without taking hours to learn how to get there? It meets a need specifically for creatives who, whether they can draw or not, need an immediate source of clothing sketches that they can draw from to do their work. I would see fashion design students and graphic artists who do a lot of character sketches for stories and comics using a book like this. So, this example also goes back into understanding the needs of your audience and then presenting it creatively. Now, on to the next point. Take your time. Don't take forever. Have a schedule and a timeline and try to stick to it. But don't rush your nonfiction book. The reason why I say this is because you need to take time to collect information. Nonfiction depends heavily on information from facts and memory, which means it takes time to verify and put together. So collect as much information as you can. As I said, even if you don't use it in your book, it can inform your narrative in some way, but you don't want your book to come out only to realize that that story in that interview that you didn't verify actually wasn't true. A great example of this, meaning a good example, not a bad one, is not only A Society Under Siege by Ramesh Deosaran, which I mentioned before, and has a wealth of newspaper excerpts and interviews and photographs from the time that inform about the events as it happened then. But I also love A Spirited Butterfly, A History of Fashion in Trinidad and Tobago by Rosemary Stone. In it, she introduces readers to a careful curation of beautiful fashion photographs from as far back as the early 20th century. You can tell that the photographs really shaped the narrative as she sought to prove that high or hot fashion was not just confined solely to Europe and New York, but existed in the Caribbean as well during the birth of the most important fashion eras known to society. When you have a topic as big as this to present, you need to take your time with it. And I hate to see when authors rush their work just for the sake of saying it is done. It also needs to be done well. And many things need to be considered when creating great bodies of both non-fiction and fiction work. So moving on. It's the way you tell your story. It's the way you tell it. As Caribbean people, we have a unique way of relating events. The events might be true, which means you can't make up extra details to add excitement, but using your own unique storytelling, you can create a more engaging exposition by invoking some kind of emotional response, whether it be sadness, anger, nostalgia, or happiness. For instance, in Alan Lumsden's Tobago Bombboats, The Glory Days, he relates a situation on one of their first visits to the Grenadines for competitive boat racing where one of their boats collided with one of the Carriacou vessels. He could have just said that the captains almost got into a fight over it, but instead he gave us this little relatable paragraph. Well, here we are in a strange land with people we do not know, and the unthinkable happens. When both boats were pulled up on the beach, both captains squared off with fire in their eyes. I thought to myself, oh boy, look how far we come to get cut us. The language and descriptions you use will help the reader not only see the situation the way you did, but relate to it as well, even if they've never been a sailor battling for first place on the high seas against others just as enthusiastic as themselves. Always remember that even as a non-fiction writer, you still have to imbue your book with your own unique voice. However you choose to do this is up to you, but using the examples in this session can help greatly. So before I review, please follow my social media links. I'm on LinkedIn as TrueNix, which is normally where I engage with persons if they're making editing requests. My website name is Writers Eagle. The link for that is www.truenix.wixsite.com/Writers Eagle. And I encourage you to sign up there, so anytime I open back up for editing requests, you'll get the email. Otherwise, you can find me on Facebook at TrueNix Projects. You can also follow my blog at criticsmaylie.wordpress.com. So to wrap up, let's review. Find your why. If you understand what your book has that your audience needs, not just externally but internally as well, this is your foundation. Build your book with this in mind. Just because your book is nonfiction doesn't mean it doesn't involve storytelling and can benefit from having a story structure. Find creative ways to present your narrative by using dialogue, conducting interviews, and using pictures, illustrations, charts, and graphs. Take your time and do your research well. Do not cut corners with facts when it comes to nonfiction. Remember, the way you tell your story is important, and it should represent your own unique voice as a writer. And that's it. I would like to thank you for coming to this session and thank Caribbean Books Foundation for hosting it. Have a great remaining Saturday. Follow Caribbean Books Foundation on Facebook and Books Caribbean on Twitter if you haven't already, and you'll see all the updates to the Caribbean Authors blog there as well. This is Trunix, and thanks again for coming.